This is an absolute privilege and pleasure to be sitting with someone who genuinely, when I sit with you, we have a very difficult time staying on topic. We're old friends. There's a surrealness of even being on camera in front of microphones when we speak. Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm, thank you so much for joining today.
I'm so excited to be here.
So we're talking about like a very interesting topic that I thought of you for, and that is we're talking about outreach, how communities can reach beyond themselves. And I've been watching what you've been doing with BZ Media, which is this organization that you've like really reimagined as a media company. But where you're reaching has totally fascinated me, that it seems that your core demographic is not the Orthodox Jewish world. It's not the non-Orthodox Jewish world. It is the non-Jewish world. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Why are you running, and it's a Jewish organization. Mm-hmm. What interest would a Jewish organization have in reaching non-Jews?
So there's a tactical answer and a strategic answer. The tactical answer is we're 15.7 million people. We're very small. So on the one hand, you need people who are shoring up the house, making sure that it works well. We couldn't do anything that we do if that work wasn't getting done. But as it happens, that work it's either getting done well, or at the very least, there's a lot of people paying attention to it. I don't know how much value how much marginal value I
within our community,
yeah,
within the Jewish community, in the widest sense,
right?
There are a lot of players there already.
To give one example, there's a great podcast called the 1840 Podcast, which is
I appreciate that.
Which is
I appreciate you. Thank
resource.
you.
Put earmuffs on for a second. It's the greatest resource in the Jewish world. They don't need an extra marginal Ari Lamm doing anything. Whereas speaking to the outside world, to me, at a very tactical level, it's an existential question. So you could look at Jewish history, pick any point at Jewish history. You could pick times of tragedy. You could pick times of wild success. So to give examples of each, the Holocaust just continues ad infinitum, like what's happening to the Uyghurs in China, without lots of people stepping in. And you could argue people aren't stepping in order to help the Jews. But if you look at the way the discourse about getting involved in World War I and how the discourse around liberation goes, there actually is a lot of real concern about what do we do about Jews in our midst. It's a huge topic across Europe and the Anglosphere for a very long time. So people thinking about us, and we'll get more into this in a little bit, but people thinking about us has major implications when we're suffering. By contrast, or similarly rather, when we're succeeding, the greatest things that we accomplish, often we accomplish with the help, alliance, the friendship of people outside our community. Just to give one small example.
Yeah, what comes to mind when you think of something like that?
Give one small example. The Beis HaMikdash. When Shlomo HaMelech builds the Beis HaMikdash, it is not an internal project. It's a project that Shlomo HaMelech conceives. It had been a dream of his father's, and he sets out to actually complete that vision. What he does, one way that you could have told the story, and the truth is, from the perspective of the ancient world, the way that anybody outside of the biblical tradition would have expected that we would tell the story is that this is the apogee of the zenith of Jewish accomplishment. We did it ourselves. We built it ourselves. Instead, what happens is Shlomo HaMelech reaches out to all of the great kings of the Levant, and he says, "Look, I'm building a building. I'll build it on my own if I have to. But if you partner with me, if you invest in us as a people, and if we actually build this in partnership together, we will build the greatest structure the world has ever seen. It will inspire generations, and it will launch a civilization." And so Hiram Melech Tzur, Hiram king of Tyre, heeds the call. And he says, "Actually, I've had good relationships with your father. Our kingdoms, these are the great Phoenician kingdoms. Our kingdoms actually have worked together in the past. Let's work together on this." Beis HaMikdash gets built with Phoenician laborers and with Phoenician investment.
So in your analogy, which is such a fascinating analogy, and people, when they think of the construction of the Beis HaMikdash, rarely think about the non-Jewish support that was that
second Beis HaMikdash also.
That
second Beis HaMikdash is with Persian investment. And by the way, It's not like I'm just using extra biblical evidence and archaeology to reconstruct something that the Tanakh has hidden from you. Tanakh is wildly enthusiastic about this. Tanakh says, of course, Hiram Melech.
You don't need to become Indiana Jones and an archaeologist to find this
exactly.
stuff.
You can be just cool with snakes, and you can still. So I mean, the second Beis Hamikdash is built because the Persians, as a matter of their foreign policy, actually, and we know from extra biblical sources, they were sending all the people that the Babylonians had exiled back to their homelands to build their temples. There was the way they conquered the way the Persians from the backwaters of Iran conquered the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, the Babylonians, who just defeated people of Ashur, the people of Mitzrayim, was because they said to all the peoples that the Babylonians had conquered, we're going to help restore you. And the Jews were the beneficiaries of that. And of course, the Navi says this only happens because HaKadosh Baruch Hu drives this change in history. And it happens on exactly the time scale that Yirmiyahu Navi forecasts. But nevertheless, or not nevertheless, but it's precisely that point that Tanakh is emphasizing, which is that actually you partnering with the nations of the world to do something great is the Yad Hashem in history. That is the Yad Hashem in history.
So here's my question, because if I would have heard your analogy and apply it to contemporary times, I would say the vision, having heard Ari Lamm articulate from how the Beis Hamikdash was constructed, I would say the role of Jews nowadays is to what we should be doing is advocating for government funding for our institutions so we can build them. That's the Beis Hamikdash project. So we need government funding and this and that, and we have people doing fantastic stuff in that area. That is not what you do. Meaning,
right.
What is the Beis Hamikdash? What is the temple you are trying to build? Meaning, you are going out and engaging in the non-Jewish world about religious sensibility.
Oh, yeah.
What are you trying to build?
Well, this gets to the strategic element that I was talking about. So at the level of tactics, you just want to get big things done. The more people who work on it, the better.
Yeah.
At a strategic level, or strategy probably doesn't do it justice. At the level of mission and vision.
Yeah, this is more than strategy.
What Shlomo Melech is doing, what Zerubbabel is doing, what Ezra and Nehemiah are doing is actually part and parcel, very consciously so, of a larger vision that Tanakh lays out that begins with Avraham and it goes all the way through to Yeshayahu Hanavi, to Yirmiyahu Hanavi, all the way to Zechariah and Malachi.
What's that vision?
And that is, think about the example that you used. We should want funding for our government funding for our yeshivas. Now
that's like a well-trodden. That's the classic application.
Yeah. I'm a big, as we both are, a big Avi Helfand fan.
I've had him on, former guest on the pod.
Exactly. I'm very much in favor of that for all the reasons that Avi articulates, which is, we are true citizens of this country.
But that's not what you do.
That's not what I'm saying is we should want that no matter what our shuls and yeshivas look like. But the reason why we should want something like that actually is contingent on what kind of institutions we build. For example, if you're comparing a yeshiva to the Beis Hamikdash, well, note that the Navi very deliberately identifies the Beis Hamikdash as Beisi Beis Tefillah Yikari L'chol Ha'amim. The point of the Beis Hamikdash was not just to be, a fortress, like a fortress of solitude where we hide out from the rest of the world. It's actually meant to be a place where the entirety of civilization comes to find meaning. And if you think about that, if you think about the wider context of that nevuah, I mean, we say it all the time. Their karbanos will be willfully accepted upon my mizbeach. Who's they? It's not us. It's the Amim Rabbim. It's the nations. You think about Yeshayahu.
The non-Jewish world.
Yeah. Yeshayahu Hanavi says, how does Yeshayahu Hanavi in the second parak of Yeshaya imagine the redemption? It's a very specific process. He says, "V'hayab acharis hayamim nachon ye'ar beis Hashem barosh ha'arim v'nisa migvos v'naru elav kol hagoyim." All the nations are going to stream.
We translate that whole thing from the beginning.
So, and it will be in the end of days. The house of God shall sit secure atop all the hills, and it will be above all of the mountains. And all the nations of the world shall stream to it.
Okay.
And then the next pasuk says, "V'halchu amim." This is the end of this pasuk at least is famous. "V'halchu amim rabim v'yamaru." And the nations of the world will come and they will say, "L'chu v'na'aleh el har Hashem el beis Elokei Yaakov." Let us go up to the mountain of God, to the house of the God of Jacob. V'yoreinu midrachav v'nelcha b'orchosav, and and we will be taught in its ways, and we'll walk its paths. With what with what result? Ki mitzion tetzei Torah dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. And as a consequence, the word of the Lord shall go forth from Zion, and the Torah shall go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So what Yeshayahu is envisioning is a world in which the bris, the covenant that HaKadosh Baruch Hu bequeathed to our people, will serve as a source of inspiration for all the nations of the world. And if you think about it, that's just a very straightforward, logical culmination of the very, very first promise HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes to Avraham, which is, I'm making a bris with you. Why? I'm not going to explain. The point is, when I make this covenant with you, it's the first thing God says to him. Right? I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse. And through you, all the nations of the world all the families of the earth will be blessed. The entire point of chosenness, the entire reason why God selects a people and then selects a land for them to live in, and then makes a specific covenant with them, and more importantly, is the only tradition in the entirety of religious history that says, here are the boundaries of the land that you're allowed to live in. Your land is actually only yay big.
Is that true? Is that unique to the Torah?
Well, yeah.
That we have specific boundaries for our land.
Yes, it's the only one. And by the way, think about how revolutionary that is, how absurd that would have seemed in the context of so many other religious traditions. The whole point of every other tradition is
conquer the whole
world.
Conquer
the world. That's how you know your God is powerful. And when you've been defeated, that's a sign that your God is weak. Or even if it's not conquer the world, spread this to everybody. We need everybody to be like us. And if not everybody is like us, it's a sign of civilizational diminution, right? So what our tradition says is God says, look, I did the whole humanity thing. I did Adam and Chava, didn't work out. I did Cain and Hevel, they couldn't live together without killing each other. I even started from scratch again. I did a Mabul. I shook the Etch-a-Sketch board.
Start from scratch.
That was a disaster. And it culminates in Migdal Bavel, in empire, right? What God does in Genesis 12, in Bereshis Perek Yud Beis, is God says, you know what? I'm going to throw out the playbook and call an audible, right? What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to choose one family. They're not going to be representative of anything. Unlike Adam and Chava, Avram and Sarah are not like archetypes for all of humanity. It's not like these are the first people who are the ancestors of everybody.
Yeah.
They're just two randos from the backwaters of Mesopotamia in a way, right?
Yeah.
And
we're not told in the Torah why they were selected.
We know, of course, that Avraham is extraordinarily righteous, and Sarah as well, obviously.
Sure.
But crucially, the Torah doesn't tell us that's why God chose him, right?
Yes.
God says, "Laman asher yitav," like I've chosen you for the purpose of doing this,
doing good, but it doesn't have an origin story like Spider-Man.
Bereshis Yud Beis begins in media res.
Yeah,
like you just pan into a scene. Here's a guy
mid-story.
It's like the way some podcasts begin, where you're just in the middle of a sentence,
right?
So God says, I'm choosing
after the YouTube commercial, and you come back into it. You're like, where were we?
Exactly. You're like really.
Why are they yelling at each other?
You're really engrossed in Mucinex. Like I was actually into this. So the story starts, and it's just God saying, "Look, I'm going to choose a family, and I'm going to make sure, and I'm going to tell them." They're not representative of the human story. Why? I'm going to give them very specific commands that are just for them, not for other people. I'm going to give them a very specific land that's for them. It's not, and others are welcome there, but this is their land. They're meant to be in charge of it. At least if they're righteous, I mean them to be in charge of it. I'm going to make promises to them I'm going to make promises to other peoples as well, as we see in the Nevi'im. But I'm going to make very specific promises about what's going to happen to this people for good and for ill. And I'm going to follow their story. What's the point of all of this? Because God is saying, the beauty of my creation is that it's deeply diverse, it's deeply different. Every single people that I've created has their own story, has their own origin point, and has their own experiences. And as a consequence, they're actually there are all sorts of different ways to relate to me. You can see this within Yahadus itself. There's so many different portals of entry into a relationship with God, Tefillah, Talmud Torah, Chesed, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to demonstrate with the experiment of this people that a people can be righteous. And I'm going to implant them within a society and within a way of life. And their job is to demonstrate that through living in conformity with the expectations God has set for us, you can prosper both spiritually, nationally, physically even, but morally. And therefore, you will all know that all of you are capable of that as well. So the point, therefore, once you know that, it makes perfect sense to say.
That last point, in order that everyone should know that you are also capable. We're like a prototypical family nation.
And you don't need
we model what it means to have a particularistic identity for the rest of the world, so to speak.
Precisely. And that's like, you don't need an achron like in the back of the Pischei Tshuva to figure out like why Kadosh Baruch Hu cares about this. He tells you beferish in a pasuk in the very beginning of Perek Yud Beis of Bereshis, all the way down through Yeshayahu, Zachariah, Malachi, Yecheskel, Yirmiyahu. They all talk about this. Like everybody.
So here's my question. This is fascinating. Why does it fascinate me? Because you are an Orthodox rabbi. You're also you have a PhD from Princeton, I believe.
Boom.
There it is. There it is.
Fine New Jersey institution.
You also have, and let's talk about this. You have a fairly prominent last name, Lamm.
Right.
Lamm, who your grandfather, Rabbi Norman Lamm, was the president of Yeshiva University. Here is my question.
I'm like the knockoff like Fendi bag that you buy in Hong Kong, you know, like
this issue.
I have the brand name.
Why you? Why you? Not the abbreviation. That was a genuine Freudian pun.
I wasn't sure which one it was. You didn't finish the sentence. Yeah.
Ari Lamm is a product of modern Orthodox royalty. You are. That's fair to say. Right. Modern Orthodox royalty. You should be, like most modern Orthodox who were raised in that, laser focused on the modern Orthodox community. And the messages that you seem to be saying are things that, like, if I didn't know you well, I would have assumed that those are the values of somebody maybe more progressive, more universal, more, politically way off to the left. You are like old-fashioned centrist and more or less. And what I'm trying to understand is how does this relate to your conception of modern Orthodoxy? Because in the history, modern Orthodoxy has always had a reticence with anything that sniffs of interfaith dialogue. Why is what you're doing, how do you make sense of it? How do you square it with your modern Orthodox upbringing and the very real distance that the community from Rabbi Soloveitchik deliberately made? We don't go out and have these conversations with non-Jews.
Yeah, ironically, I don't think it's ironic, but I feel like listeners might find it ironic. Progressives, I find, make my jobs infinitely more difficult. And the people in our broader community who I think not always, often not, but sometimes can be the most intuitive about just having a really positive and inspirational relationship with the wider world is the yeshiva world. Or probably more specifically Hasidim. Like I find like Hasidim actually can interact with people in a very positive way when they're not thinking about how to do it. And just being
Why
themselves.
Do you mean that? Why are?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I often get invited into like, for lack of a better, not for lack of a better term, this is what they themselves call it. I get invited into a lot of like interfaith spaces. When I was younger, I used to go to them just because like figured, that way people know who I am.
Yeah.
Now I avoid them like the plague.
You avoid them.
I avoid them.
Why isn't that like your sweet spot?
Yeah. So first of all, much of that stuff I feel like is like halachically problematic, but even bracketing that for a second, I find that the idea of coming into a room, and I think this might surprise some people, but a lot of the premise of like, for example, Jewish-Christian dialogue in the wake of the Holocaust is like, you know what? We have an opportunity to start fresh. We'll change a little bit about what we think. You'll change a little bit about what you think. And in the interest, and
we'll have this happy medium. We can all get along.
Well, it's a Bayesian solution to figuring out like, if you want to lean your seat back in the airplane and I don't, I'll pay you $100 and that's an optimal outcome, right?
Yeah.
And now you'll keep your seat forward. You're happy because you have $100 and I'm happy because you're
cozy and bargaining.
Yeah. I'm cozy and that's what I was looking for.
I got you.
So there we go. So doing that with...
I just corrected Ari Lamm. I feel like we should stop right here. I'm sorry.
Great.
That felt really good. I I feel. Can I enjoy it? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Let's just sit in that for a second.
Just sit in it.
That was good. No, I feel like doing that with your most closely held beliefs is so disrespectful, both to yourself and to your interlocutor. Like we're so loosey-goosey with everything we think that we can haggle about it like we're at a flea market. It just seems insane to me, number one. But number two, in fact, if the premise of Jews interacting with the wider world is what you find in Tanakh, which is that through being obedient to the demands, the unique demands that God makes of us, others will be inspired to ask what God demands of them and live in obedience to those demands. That makes that is completely at odds with the logic of so much interfaith discourse. Like to the extent that interfaith is just code for like we should all understand each other, then that would be like calling two friends who are, two people who are both going to the same high school for the first time and meet each other. That's like interperson dialogue. Like it's not dialogue. It's just normal people talking to each other. Like you don't need to come up with a whole fancy framework for people to be friendly. But to the extent that interfaith means like let's all negotiate our religious positions with each other, that's completely at odds with the entire premise of Tanakh's understanding of the Jewish relationship with the wider family of nations, because the whole point of it is we should be so much ourselves that the world around us is inspired to envision the world not as it is but as it ought to be, and envision themselves not as they are but as they ought to be. And so we actually need to be maximally ourselves. The more we're ourselves, the more it works. And I found that in practice, that actually is the case. Like the kind of people that we're interested in, the kind of people that are most likely to have positive, productive friendships with us are not the kind of people who are looking for us to change anything. They're actually the type of people who are most impressed when we are maximally, authentically ourselves, which is why I find often that the kind of people who, without meaning to often, like intuitively succeed in this are just people who take their faith very seriously.
But what's so fascinating to me is how much I've learned.
I didn't mean to dodge the why you modern Orthodox question. I'll get back to that. Yeah.
No. Get back to that right now. So you don't look at what you are doing as what we typically associate with interfaith dialogue. So how?
Yeah.
My question is, so what do you have to share? Like we both grew up in the Orthodox world, and it doesn't really emphasize just the study of Chumash, the Torah as a standalone text, which is where most of our time is spent on Talmud. And that's not where the real interest of the non-Jew. I mean, our friends in the non-Jewish world lies. A lot of anti-Semites are interested in the Talmud, but our
I want to come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
Can I? Okay, yeah.
Let me just finish the question. You could deal with both. What wisdom do we have that is relevant for the non-Jewish world? What do we have? Like when I read the Torah, and I love learning Torah. Don't get me wrong. I learn, Rashi and this. You read Gemaras. I have a hard time seeing what is it that we have to offer the outside world. I know how to teach somebody how to keep Shabbos, but your goal is not to get Christians to start keeping the Jewish Shabbos.
Yeah. Ironically.
Yeah.
Most problematic.
Yeah. So what is it that you're trying to teach them? You said if we're trying to build a conceptual Beis Hamikdash to find meaning, what is the meaning that we have that is relevant outside of our community?
Okay. Couple of things. I want to give a historical example of where instead of coming up with in theory how this could work, we actually know that this works. We actually know that some of the most obscure discussions within the Talmud are not only of passing interest to non-Jews, they actually shaped our entire civilization. I'll just give an example.
Yeah.
So I often I often ask people, like, what's the most Jewishly significant non-Jewish event in history? My answer,
pause. That was a great question.
You're right. Of all people, you probably would get
What is the most Jewishly significant non-Jewish event?
Yeah. Not world event, like specifically non-Jewish event. Something that we have no dog in this fight.
What jumped right away was the printing press.
Yeah, so it's like super close. It's the Protestant Reformation, which is enabled directly by the printing press. Yeah.
Your answer is the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah.
The most significant...
Jewishly significant event.
Jewishly significant non-Jewish event. Why?
So the Protestant Reformation and a lot of the stuff that's happening beforehand, it's coming at this time in European and Western history where thinkers start to say, like the greatest thinkers in all of Europe start to say, look, we've gotten... until now, the story that the West has told about itself is a story of like two peoples, right? There's on the one hand, how did our world come to be? Well, you had one ancient peoples lived on the Mediterranean who were courageous and they were brave and they were wise and they were curious. So curious, in fact, that they invented the systematic study of wisdom, namely philosophy. These people were the Greeks. And they were wonderful. And their only demerit was that though their greatest philosophers theorized that there should be one cosmic sovereign over the universe, none of the gods that they actually encountered or invented for themselves fit the bill. So Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, none of these gods fit. All the way on the other side of the Mediterranean is this other ancient people, and they were not courageous or brave or wise. They were backwards, they were fractious, they were superstitious. These people were the Jews.
Decrepit.
Yeah, exactly. Hook-nosed.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. They prematurely bald. Their only redeeming quality was that they had, against all reason, stumbled into a relationship with the exact God that the philosophers were searching for. And what Alexander the Great does is takes these two people who are tragically on opposite sides of the globe, as it were, and brings them together by conquering the world. And what happens over the course of the next couple centuries is the Jews and the Greeks working out how to relate to each other. And the church comes along and says, we actually know how to do this. The West from now on is going to be the wisdom of the Greeks in service to the God of Jerusalem, to the God of Israel, and that's actually the story.
What church event is that like brokers that deal?
So, this is it's there's no one moment where this happens, but what you can kind of see in the early stages of the church, from Justin Martyr in the 2nd century to Augustine a century later to eventually Thomas Aquinas, who's the great scholastic thinker, the project of early Christianity, or at least many important strands of early Christianity, comes to be like, how can we use the wisdom of the Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and use that in service of understanding God better? So, for example, like a lot of the medieval philosophers who sound like Christian versions of the Rambam, like they sound a lot like this.
Yeah.
Luther comes along, Martin Luther comes along.
Protestant Reformation
In the 16th century, early 16th century, and he says, this is a lovely story. Unfortunately, it's also idolatrous. Why? Because God has actually given us a specific book that tells us what he expects from us. You don't need Aristotle, you don't need Plato, you need Socrates to understand what God wants. He gave us a Bible. So just read the Bible. Until that point, it had actually been illegal for masses throughout Europe to read the Bible. Translating the Bible into a vernacular language so that people could read it was illegal. Who's the first person? I ask people this question all the time. Who's the first person to ever translate the Bible from the original Hebrew into English? The answer is William Tyndale. No one knows that name. Why not? Most people don't know that name. Why not? Because what was his reward for this?
He got executed, like persecuted, he had to run away.
Yeah,
right?
He ran away, and he's eventually captured by agents of the crown. He's burned at the stake.
Yeah. And his version is what the King James Bible basically was based off
responding to, right?
Yeah.
Because what happens
and uses a lot of his language and
exactly. So by the way,
he was killed for translating the Bible.
Exactly.
Why were Christians? I mean, we grew up Shnai Mikra. I would have thought that they're all about that. Why was that?
So if you want to understand what the book says, you need to be taught. And so just listen to your priest. If you want to know what the book says, just ask your priest. That's it. And by the way, why does the King James Bible get written? I think someone once said about it, it's the only artistic masterpiece ever designed by a committee. But it's created for almost this weirdly nefarious reason, even though it's gorgeous. But it's responding to things like the Geneva Bible and Tyndale's Bible, which are translating all these passages, and in the Geneva Bible, highlighting them. And these are all people who are suspicious of monarchy, and they're highlighting all the passages that are freedom is good, liberty is good, monarchs are bad, they're tyrannical. And King James is we can't have this stuff floating around and people reading this stuff. We need to do an authorized translation that tells people exactly how they're supposed to read this Bible so that it doesn't get out of hand.
And lead to like social unrest.
Yeah. So what Luther does, he makes this translation, this vernacular translation. It's one of the best-selling things in the history of print. And all of a sudden, people are reading the Bible for the first time across Europe. Like everybody's reading it, and people start to think to themselves, "Okay, we want to have a godly society, and this book should be our blueprint to it. But the problem with it is A, we don't often know what it means. So are we sure the translations we have are good? And if we want to make a good translation, we actually need to know, for the New Testament, you need to know Greek. But for the Hebrew Bible, for the Tanakh, you need to know Hebrew. You need to know a little bit of Aramaic. And moreover, once people start to learn those languages, then they start to realize, well, hold on, this is actually a pretty complex book. We're actually not sure what all of it means. Now, we need to be able to ask questions. We can't ask the priests because the priests are beholden to Rome. You know, what
the hierarchy of the church.
Yeah, Luther called it the whore of Babylon. We can't trust these guys. We can't ask ourselves because we don't know. So what we really need is somebody in Europe who has a long history of studying this book, who can read it in its original language, and who has a tradition of interpretation that goes back a very long time. The only people who fit that bill in all of Europe are the Yidden. Right? Like that's just these Jews.
Yeah.
And so what happens is, all of a sudden, you see...
what year are we in? We're in the...
So we're like in the 1500s, and then this really takes off in the 17th century, in the 1600s. So what happens at this point is the greatest thinkers in all of Europe start to say, we actually need to start reading rabbinic literature. And as like some of their Yechidei Skulas start to read rabbinic literature, they're like, this stuff is amazing. And so they start to translate it into Latin and then into English and French. And so what happens over the course of the late, 16th and early 17th century...
Christian Hebraists are like...
Here are some of the works that get translated into like major languages.
Yeah.
The Mishnah, the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, Midrash Rabbah, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Zohar, the works of Rashi, Radak, the Ibn Ezra, all the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, the Moner Vuchim of the Rambam, go on and on. All the works of Rabbi
All the
Levi,
classics, basically.
all the classics, and the greatest thinkers in the history of Europe start to voraciously consume this stuff.
Such as?
So, I'll give you a practical example. The great thinkers in England start to think, and on the continent, start to ask themselves the following question. As the wars of religion are raging because of the Reformation, so the biggest question that Europeans have to face is like, how do we have a virtuous political order that God will love and bless so that we can stop all of this violence? Like our problem must be that we're not living in conformity to what God wants. Okay, well, what kind of government does God want? Well, before this like biblical revolution, so people are exposed mostly to like the Gospels and letters of Paul, which doesn't have political wisdom in it, and that's okay. So they just assume, all right, if we want political wisdom, we need to find it elsewhere. So where do they go? Everybody goes to Aristotle. Aristotle says, look, it's called constitutional pluralism. He says it kind of doesn't matter what political order you have as long as you have a virtuous version of it. So there's government by, one person, by some people, and by many people. And they have good and bad versions. The good version of governed by one person is monarchy. The bad version is tyranny. Good version by some people is aristocracy. The bad version is oligarchy. The good version of governed by everybody is what he calls just constitutionalism. And the bad version, he says, is democracy, right? So as long as you have a good version of whatever it is you choose, that's fine. And this is even if you simplify, this is the unanimous opinion of Western political thought for like 1,000 years. All of a sudden, the Bible gets translated and people are reading it. And then chazal get translated and people are reading it. And the greatest minds in Europe begins with Claude de Salmasius. He's one of the greatest monarchist writers in all of Europe.
Say his name one more time.
Salmasius. He goes by Salmasius.
Okay.
This is like one of King James Bible fame. It's like his favorite political writer. Salmasius says, I actually found the sugya in Maseches Sanhedrin, and he quotes it, and this becomes widely quoted throughout the highest levels of European political discourse. He says, the sugya says that when the Jewish people entered into the land of Israel, they had 3 commands. They had to, potentially in some particular order, but maybe not, they have to eradicate the Amalekites, Amalek, they have to build the base of Achira, and they have to appoint a king. Having a king is actually not an option, like Aristotle thought. It's actually a chiyuv. It's a chiyuv midoraisa. And
So
so
you get like there's a biblical command.
Yeah.
We need a monarchy.
yeah, and for the first time in the West, on the one hand, you get what's called monarchical exclusivism. The idea that not only may you have a king, you actually have to have a king. And this is where we get the rise of things like divinely chosen monarchs and
Sure.
the divine right of kings. It only comes about because of this period. On the other side, you have probably the greatest defender of republics in the history of republicanism, John Milton of Paradise Lost.
Sure.
So John Milton, one of the great, well-known writers in all of Europe. He's in England and then eventually across the Channel. So he is reading one of the earlier Hebraic thinkers, William Schickard, less well known, but he's reading Schickard, and he sees in his book a translation of Midrash Rabbah, and Milton happens upon a keta from Devarim Rabbah, which says the following. The Midrash says, it's commenting on a pasuk in Yirmiyahu. It says, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Banai, kach hashapti shetiya cheres min hamalchios. My children, I always intended that you should be free of kings. V'atem lo chashaptem kim, but you had other plans. And he quotes the pasuk in Yirmiyah that you're like a para limud midbar, you're like a wild donkey in the desert. Just like a wild donkey has no rider, so too you should have had no kings but myself. But you wanted something else. And he quotes about, he says, Asher shafa ruach, that you were snuffing up wind, the ein ruach el malchios, and wind is like kingship. And then Rabbi Shua ben Levi comes in and he quotes the pasuk.
This is all being quoted by
Milton
of Paradise Lost.
And it gets better.
Where's he writing this?
And it's a work called Pro Populo Anglicano Defensio, which is in
Okay.
defense of the English people. And he says, and then it gets better.
I'm letting you go because I find this riveting. I really do.
But then get this, it gets even
Yeah.
better. He says, okay, then he quotes the end of the Midrash. In the end of the Midrash, Rabbi Shua ben Levi quotes the pasuk of Al tiftechu ben divim. Don't trust in princes, in flesh and blood princes.
Yeah.
And he says, Kol mi sheboteach.
This is your Shua ben Levi in this Midrash Rabbah.
It says, Kol mi sheboteach ba'kadosh baruch hu, zoch lios kayotzi bo. So now, if you trust only in God, then you merit to be counted among His people. And he says, Kol mi sheboteach ba'avodah zara. Anyone who trusts in kings, which he defines as idolatry, nischayev lios kayotzi bo. Then your end will be like idolatry, be smashed to bits. So Milton says, actually, if all you do is quote that sugya in Sanhedrin, you haven't exhausted the resources of rabbinic thought on political order. In fact, the original, the view of chazal and Devarim Rabbah is that actually having a king was never part of the plan. Meaning, Kadosh Baruch Hu, and then he explains. He says in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, when God says you may have a king, so you may have a king. He says because He knows we're going to ask for one. In Shmuel Aleph, when the people actually ask for a king with exactly the same language, and God goes ballistic, and Shmuel goes ballistic, and God goes ballistic, how do you explain that? Isn't a contradiction with Devarim? Milton says very simple. This is based on this Midrash. You can see exactly what's happening. What happens is, of course, it's sinful to ask for a king, but God knows that we are a sinful people, and God makes lots of allowances for the Bnei Yisrael to be sinful. When Klal Yisrael actually asks for a king, God says, okay, you've asked for a king. You're going to be punished. You know what your punishment is? You're going to get exactly what you asked for, right?
You're going to get a king.
And God says, in Shmuel, He says, here's what's going to happen. He's going to destroy you. He's going to be a tyrant. He's going to steal your children. He's going to force you to become laborers. And so Milton says, actually, the original plan that God has, as the rabbis tell us, is that we should have a republic. And then he says, and I quote, I follow the opinion of these rabbis. This is the birth of the tradition called Republican exclusivism. The idea that you may, not only is it okay to have a republic, you actually have to have a republic. Having a king is an act of idolatry. Now, this kind of radical thought dies down in England. Why? Because after the Glorious Revolution, where you have this like constitutional crisis and the monarchy and a Catholic king and the Protestant Anglican population. So basically what England does is it kind of deposes its Catholic king without spilling a drop of blood, a huge accomplishment. They invite in William and Mary, and they turn the whole island into the whole British Isle into a constitutional monarchy where they have a king, but doesn't really have any power. All the power is with Parliament. So nobody really wants to rock the boat. We just figured out this Glorious Revolution thing. Sure, we have a king. Maybe it's an idol, but like no one really wants to get into this. Like we got to smash the monarchy. So it kind of like dies down, except it still survives. And eventually that view is taken across the ocean by a young, ne'er-do-well, jumped up commoner whose really only accomplishment in life eventually becomes that he writes a pamphlet that ignites the American Revolution. It's Thomas Paine, and he writes a pamphlet called Common Sense. And in it, the most popular argument and most important argument that he makes is this argument, basically plagiarizing Milton. He says, having a king is an act of idolatry, as you can see in the Hebrew literature, as you can see in the Hebrew Bible, as we know from the Jewish sources. Now, John Adams, and this becomes the most popular argument that ignites the American Revolution. John Adams hates this because John Adams is like this aristocratic guy, and he sees Paine as like this guy who's like too big for his britches. And so he actually writes in his journal, he says, I accused Paine of plagiarizing that section from Milton where he says, I follow these rabbis. And Paine was like, of course I plagiarized from this. That section was awesome, right? And so chazal ignite the American Revolution. So if you ask, like, why, and there's so, by the way, there that's one example. You could give a dozen others where if you look at every single serious thinker in the West at the time, specifically in the Anglosphere, names we know: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, John Milton, John Selden, Hugo Grotius, and then go down to the founding fathers. Every single one of them is either reading Hebrew, certainly reading chazal. Like everybody's reading chazal, and they are taking those ideas seriously in order to build what all of these figures, including our founding fathers, called a Respublica Hebraeorum, a Hebrew republic, modeled on the ideal set out in Devarim and Tanakh. Devarim becomes the most quoted work in the entire era of the American founding. It's not even close. Not even close.
This is absolutely mind-blowing, but I want to bring it back down to like our lived experience
100%.
as Jews,
Yeah,
and how this like affects. What really fascinates me about your approach to Yiddishkeit and all just your approach to your work is like you exude a real belief that we have something.
Yeah.
And not only do you believe it, like you show us and the world, like you have these threads on Twitter, which I never appreciated the full significance of them until just now. There's these amazing threads, which I'm sure you're working on to put them into a book called
Why Read the Bible in Hebrew?
Why Read the Bible in Hebrew? And these amazing threads that we could link to your like key ones. They're so brilliant. But here's my question. You have this amazing like big picture view of what we have and what we're trying to achieve and what we're bringing to the outside world. How does it not infringe or suffocate your ability to appreciate the actual very particularistic lived experience of an Orthodox Jew? How do you balance those two?
So I think there are like two kind of separate threads there. One is like, how do you take like a historical discussion of John Milton, which your average person on the street isn't interested in exploring, right?
I'm being honest, I was like at the edge of my seat. Yeah.
But
I love that stuff.
How do you take that and make it real for like your average normal American kid? That's one type of question. Another question is, how do you square this with, or at least how does this impact my experience? Exactly.
Yeah.
So the way I see it is, you asked earlier about like modern Orthodoxy, right? So I had an opportunity a bunch of years ago to interview Rabbi Sachs.
Sure.
John Sachs. And one of the questions
in Lamport, Yeshiva University.
That's
I remember
right.
that well.
So one of the questions I asked him was modern Orthodoxy, overrated or underrated? And he said overrated. Why overrated? So his answer was, he said, think about how far down you have to define yourself just to get there. He's like, you're not human, you're Jewish, you're not Jewish, you're Orthodox, you're not Orthodox, you're modern Orthodox, you're not modern Orthodox, you're right-wing modern Orthodox, you're not right-wing modern Orthodox, you're like RYNJ, right-wing modern Orthodox.
Modern Orthodox, Machmir.
Exactly, right.
My least favorite description. We know that. I've been on record many times.
Right, exactly.
No worse description than modern Orthodox Machmir.
Right.
That's the hashkafa that automatically you need 2 Tylenol in the morning. You just know this person's going to be a headache. Yeah.
You know it's going to be a tough hang, right? So such a good point.
Yeah.
It's like you're immediately looking for excuses to end that conversation.
Yeah, it is gonna be a good hang. Yeah.
So what was his point? His point was like, if we actually are gonna take seriously the task of Kimitzion Teitze Torah Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim, so we shouldn't make ourselves so small. And I appreciate that very much, and that's been very influential on how I think. But I also think it kind of does a disservice to what modern Orthodoxy is, which or among the things that modern Orthodoxy is, which is to say that ideally, modern Orthodoxy and the ideological scaffolding upon which it's built is about taking the best of what we find around us, integrating it into our Torah personality in order to make our Torah personality as rich as we possibly can. Now, the question, if that was all it was, it would be just this enormously self-indulgent project, because we're just kind of like, you're like the kind of
picking the best. So it's like Chappelle's racial draft, but just
exactly,
but just with the whole world. Like we'll take, we'll take sushi from this, and we'll take, good wealth and this from this and this, and then like just the best of all worlds.
Exactly. It's like you walk into
which a lot of people, that's their view of contemporary Orthodoxy, which is why I've lamented that I'm scared that we live in a world where it's not fun to be Orthodox unless you're wealthy.
Yeah. Right.
Where's the religion part of this? Where's the
precisely? And moreover, it's like you become a taker. Like you almost become like a spiritual parasite, right? You're just sucking up all the good stuff.
Oh, I like to learn, and I like to watch Netflix, and I like sports, and I just get to just do all the things I like.
And I think even worse than that, it is like, this is going to be very strong. I don't mean it this harshly. It's like dehumanizing to the rest of the human population. It's like you exist to produce, Robert De Niro, the purpose of your existence is to make The Godfather so that I can better understand my hashkafa. Right? Like you've fulfilled your purpose in life now that I have a better understanding.
Oh man, I feel like I've been this close to actually feeling and articulating that.
Right. But meaning, what's the purpose? Meaning,
movies are here so we could give better drushes.
Exactly. Right.
So we could explain how the Marvel Avengers and that 3 a.m. Shavuos night here.
All of you exist. Every single one of you was created for the purpose of the 3 a.m. slot on Shavuos night, right? So I think in its best form, what we actually really believe, and I think when pressed, most people who take this seriously, the vast majority of people who take this seriously, would all articulate what I'm about to articulate. Why do we do this? We integrate everything into this one holistic Torah personality so that we can then reflect that Torah personality out to the rest of the world and show them that something beautiful, something that we can actually, something through which we can actually say truly, like v'nivrchu v'cha kol mishpachos ha'adama, like we actually want to be the
source
bracha.
Of blessing for the entire world.
What's the best way to be a source of blessing? Not to mow everybody's lawn, or not to. And again, it's lovely that we show up at all the we show up at earthquakes, and we show up and we send Hatzalah to get
all
anybody.
Beautiful, all important,
all incredible. But fundamentally, the most precious thing that we have to show the rest of the world is our relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Like that's the most important thing we have to show everybody.
And how is because you've actually done work in this.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. I'll give you like a practical example.
Yeah.
I encounter this all the time in my day-to-day. We had, for example, we took a huge like TikToker with a couple million followers, mega influential, has huge hits on Spotify. Took him to Israel. And he's a young Christian kid. He'd never been to Israel, never met a Jew, had no clue what October 7th was, all this stuff, which is like basically every kid in America. And what he said was, he's like, in the first day that he was there, or the first like 2 days, because really, you're someone who's read the Bible, and now you go to the land of the Bible. He said, this is so inspiring. And he says, I just can't figure out why this is so inspiring to me, because it feels like it shouldn't be. I said, what do you mean? He said, my whole life, I'm a normal American kid. Like I grew up thinking like God wants a relationship with me anywhere, and God cares about me, and doesn't matter where I am. And like, why? And now I'm feeling like God has a people and a land. Like, I don't think that's what I believe. Like, is that what I believe? And so help me. And he was struggling to articulate, but like, help me reconcile this. And so I said, you realize how ludicrous that sounds? God cares about me in Podunk, Iowa. You realize you sound like a psychopath right now. Like, God created like black holes, the Andromeda galaxy. A black hole is the size of, this is going to be wrong, but like it's the size of like 500 suns, right? Like the author of this entire massive cosmos cares about you in Cookeville, Tennessee, in Monroe, Louisiana. You sound like a sociopath right now. There's a reason why most human beings for like gajillion years just assumed as a matter of course that of course the gods don't care about individual humans. At best, they care about kings and princes. They don't care about random people. How do you know that God actually cares about you, indeed cares about you in Cookeville, Tennessee? There's only one way you know. The only reason you know is because God gave a book to humanity through a people. And he said in this book, I'm going to tell you a story about a guy like Abraham and Sarah. Like I said earlier, two shebarandos from the middle of nowhere. And the entirety of this book is just going to be me following their story, their children's story, the story of their great-great-great-great-grandchildren. And the whole story is going to be about my relationship with them, the commitments that I make, the commitments that they make to me, that I demand of them, and the promises that I make to them that I'm going to keep. And actually, the book's not even going to end with the end of their story. The book is going to end by saying, in the future, for the rest of history is going to unfold with me continuing to fulfill promises to these people. That's how you know that God cares about individual people, that God actually cares about normal people.
Judaism is almost the prototype for modeling a conception of divinity that is interested about the individuality and interiority
And that's
of
why
our
you
lives.
can't start Chumash. Forget starting Chumash with the Chodesh Zelachem. You couldn't start Chumash with Yeshayahu Hanavi. Why? Because the whole idea that God cares about the Amim Rabim, that God cares about Oloseim V'Zivcheim L'Ratzon HaMizbechi.
Well, the sacrifices of the non-Jewish world and the...
It only makes sense once God has proven that he cares about specific people. So if you're the type of person, you're a normal American kid, and we have a lot of stats on Gen Z and how religious it is becoming, which is striking. But if you're like a normal American Gen Z kid, odds are you're a Christian. Odds are you're some form of non-denominational Christian, like non-evangelical, non-denominational Christian. So if you're the type of like normal kid who's just like, I think God cares about me. In fact, the only way that view of the world is coherent is if Israel and the Jewish people actually sit at its conceptual epicenter. You don't have to spend your whole life thinking about Jews, but you should understand the way that you know that the God that you believe in cares about you is because God still, to this very day, cares about the Jewish people in Klal Yisrael and cares about what happens to his people and will fulfill the promises that he makes to them. And so the way I think about it is the reason I think the kind of teachings that we have and that we are stewards of resonate so strongly with so many people is, yes, it's because of the Hebraic heritage of our country. Yes, it's because of the rabbinic origins of our modern Western civilization that values liberty and freedom from tyranny. It's because of all those things. But fundamentally, it's because the whole idea of hope in a God who cares about people, like real people, stems from us and is entirely dependent on God continuing to care about us. And it's not because we're better. It's not because we're superior. Like you said earlier, God doesn't say why he chooses us. All we know is that God does care. And therefore, the teachings that we have resonate because I think it's at a very basic level, people intuit that the role that the role that we are called to play in history connects to them, like really connects to them in a serious way.
What I find so remarkable about your approach to theology, as an analogy, there's a famous question that everybody asks around Hanukkah time, which is, why is the holiday of Hanukkah 8 days if the miracle was only 7 days? And this is because we had one jug of oil and then it lasted for 8 days, but it had enough for 1 day, so it was only 7 days of a miracle. And it's a question that has hundreds of answers. And I think I've mentioned this before, but Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi, the Doros HaRishonim, has a quote that Ari Bergman one time told me, but it's always stayed with me, where he says, I don't want one question that has 100 answers. I want one answer to 100 questions. And what I find so beautiful about your approach to theology is that you don't look at it as like, okay, here's a question like significance of non-Jews, like here's 20 approaches, and what like is Orthodoxy, non-Orthodox, like here's 50 other approaches. It's like, let's get back to the roots and the basics of what we have, what we're about. Let's really refine that one answer, and you will see that 100 questions are going to disappear.
Absolutely. That's such a perfect, that was, first of all, incredibly beautifully said. And that's such a perfect distillation. By the way,
where it all connects and you're able to see the entirety of the world and link it back to this incredibly particularistic, almost what people could misunderstand or misdiagnose as like small, insignificant, but like find that trunk that can really product to the whole world. For your work in really teaching the Jewish people and teaching the world what we have as humanity, as the Jewish people, I'm so incredibly grateful, obviously, for your friendship, for your scholarship. And really teaching us what it means to reach beyond, and you can't reach beyond unless you know what you have right here in that most particularistic sense. I always wind down my interviews with more rapid fire questions.
Let's rock and roll.
Here we go. I'm so fascinated with this interplay of reaching beyond, and you have all of this fascinating history from Christian Hebraicism of how Jewish knowledge has really moved history. What are your favorite books that really highlight how the Jewish community has reached beyond and moved history? It could be academic, it could be popular.
Yeah.
What are your faves?
Probably if I could like recommend one.
Yeah.
Eric Nelson has an incredible book called The Hebrew Republic. And it's just about this. It changed my life. It quite literally changed my life, how I think about everything. And it articulates this process from the Reformation to now.
Eric Nelson, The Hebrew Republic.
Yeah. Best book I can recommend.
I am done. I'm going to be ordering it on
It's
Amazon.
a little dense, but I feel like this podcast audience is...
We're ready. We are ready. No, we do. It's one for me, one for you, one for me, one for you. You know what it is. Exactly. You know what it is. They're used to it. They know. My next question is: if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to go back to school and get, in your case, a second PhD, take a sabbatical, study as long as you need. Yeah. What do you think the subject and title of your dissertation would be? And if you can, tell us what your actual dissertation was on, and then what would your second one be?
So my actual dissertation was on Jewish and eventually Christian intellectual history from 200 BC to 200 CE.
Wow. Okay.
Dense. Don't recommend it, but you can find it for free.
Would
online.
read. Okay.
What would I get a second one in? I guess if I have the freedom to be like totally self-indulgent,
sure.
Economics. I'm obsessed with the question of economic growth and why it's good. I said this on another podcast recently, but
that we don't want to hear. No, I'm just...
exactly. I didn't say what it was, but I find it like crazy that in the just plethora of literature that's been produced on Jewish understanding of economics. Like you have so much about like the don'ts, the don't do this, like here are the limits. You have almost nothing, like really almost, and I say almost just because I know I don't have the Bakiyas to say definitely nothing, but almost nothing on why is economic growth good for the world and for the Jewish community specifically? Like why should we prioritize it as a thing? Just general economic growth year over year. Absolutely
fascinating. My final question, as always, I'm fascinated by people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night and what time do you wake up in the morning?
So if you'd asked me this last year, the answer would have been, 2 a.m. about, and then catch like a 9:15 minion. I have radically altered that, and I've started doing like the...
You're not waking up early.
Yeah, I started.
You're an early riser guy?
I changed everything.
This is like hearing that like a friend of yours, you were both chain smokers, and the other one finally quit, and you're like, oh, shoot.
I don't know if it's better, but it's definitely different.
You're a morning person now?
I'm like making my way there. I've always wanted to be like
I love you, but I'm just letting you know we're going to end on this. I feel deeply betrayed right now. Deeply betrayed. This is going to hurt our friendship. Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm, my dearest friend, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And this is genuinely, if I'll add one more rapid fire question for myself, I could recommend one podcast, it's this one.
You are the best. Thank you so much.